Trail and ultra runners, what is going on? What's happening? Welcome to another episode of the Koop Cast. As always, I'm your humble host, Coach Jason Koop, and on this episode of the podcast it is all about the new Oura Ring 3, which is just about ready to hit the marketplace. And if you have not had your social media feed inundated with advertisements and influencers trying to peddle this ring on you, you certainly will after listening to this podcast, because somehow they're going to track it back to you and your interest has been perked. They're really good at that, by the way, because right when I started researching this ring, I started getting all kinds of advertisements all over Twitter and all over Instagram. This episode of the podcast was inspired by a number of people who reached out to me on social media and asked, is this type of technology worth it? Can I incorporate it into my training? And if I choose to do so, how? And so I got together with a crack team of our coaches, Stephanie Howe, Corrine Malcolm, and Ryne Anderson, all who have been on this podcast before, to discuss this from a very practical point of view, just like we would in our own coaching groups and just like we would with our own athletes that we worked with. I learned a lot out of doing the research on this and throughout the course of this conversation. I hope everybody out there does as well. So here we go. I'm going to get right out of the way. Here's my conversation with Stephanie Howe, Corrine Malcolm, and Ryne Anderson, all about the Oura 3. The reason I wanted to bring y'all on to talk about this is not because any of us are sleep experts or wearable experts or technology experts or anything like that, but we're all obviously coaches. And I don't know about you guys, but I've been flooded like the last week, specifically with the question, is the new Oura Ring worth it? Question mark. And the worth it piece is valuable to discuss because it's $300 and now they've got a new, revenue model for that, for being able to view and have access to certain parts of your data. And athletes are always kind of making this like value proposition, like, do I get a new pair of shoes, or do I get this wearable, or do I go to an altitude camp or whatever? And it's kind of getting thrown at them left, right, and center. So anyway, that's the genesis of this. Is I'm getting a lot of questions, and I wanted us to discuss it kind of from a coaching perspective, given the fact that there is a new device out there, we can kind of broaden it out to a lot of the other wearables. So before we start out, does anybody have any effort? Ryne, we're going to start with you because you're in the upper left of my screen, so I'm going to go in that order. Does anybody have any efforts of full disclosure? Are you sponsored by any of these wearables? Have you gotten any of them for free? And if you are currently like personally using any of them, I think we should answer those three right off the bat.
No on all those accounts.
Steph?
I am not sponsored by any of them, and I do not personally use any of the devices.
Corrine?
Yeah, I'm the weirdo in the room. I've used Whoop via Adidas as part of their research out of the lab in Portland. Don't currently use it. I find it's got some of its own bugs, and they are also launching a new product, I think, too. And then I'm going to be testing out the third generation of the Oura Ring for free, but no, their compensation in the coming months.
Are they going to lease it to you?
I mean, they probably should. No, longtime Red Bull manager Aaron Lutzi has moved over to be one of their managers at Oura Ring, and so just kind of like the friends and family discount.
Sure. Okay. Yeah, I'm not sponsored or paid by any of these. I don't even accept them for free, even when they ask me to. If I want to use them, any of these, I pay for them out of my own pocket. I use them and see if they're worth anything. I currently am not using anything as an activity tracker other than my trusty Garmin, which I paid for full price.
And they're expensive, full price.
I can't wait till the Garmin 7 comes out. That's neither here nor there. So I was coming up with a way to set this up, and literally at the last minute, for whatever reason, I came up with the simplest analogy for people to kind of properly understand this value proposition that people inevitably have when they're evaluating technology. And it comes down to the power meter in the early 2000s, which we've talked about as a coaching group is a lot, but I think the analogy really holds true here. So in the early 2000s, cycling-based power was widely recognized as something that was valuable for athletes to evaluate. We could look at it out on the field or in a lab, and we could take those numbers and make sense out of them and use them in a really practical and powerful way to improve athletic performance. But at the time, the limiting factor was kind of twofold. Is one, the power meters, really there was one of them. It's SRM, they have a service center based here in Colorado. Colorado Springs was just it actually was just getting booted up when I moved out here. But the first limiting factor was they were just clunky. They're big, they're heavy. Nobody wanted to ride them in the pro peloton because they were just too heavy. And the second thing is they're super expensive. They were probably about $4 or $5 grand at the time, and this was in the early 2000s. So based on inflation, that's like 10 grand now or something like that. They were really cost prohibitive for your normal everyday athlete to kind of get a hold of. But we recognized it as and this is the important part. We recognized it as the gold standard of measuring power, and we recognized that was important. So fast forward a few years, and all these other players started coming out on the marketplace. We want to remove these barriers to entry. We're going to make them more affordable and lighter, in order to increase mass adoption. And so you saw PowerTap come into the marketplace, and instead of measuring power at the level of the crank arm, they were measuring power at the hub. It was smaller, more cost effective, and then you had Polar come along, and they took a completely different approach for measuring power. They put a little sensor on the chainstay, which is the part of the bike frame that's just below the chain, and they measured the speed and vibration of the chain and somehow correlated that to power. And the effort of all of these things was to take this gold standard that SRM had created, which is measuring power, and all power is force and velocity. So we know the torque that's being applied to the crank arms, and we know the velocity of the crank arms. Force times the velocity is power. That's, simple physics. And they're trying to come up with different ways to measure and capture that gold standard. What we're seeing with a lot of the wearables is very similar, in particular regards to the sleep staging, which is, I think, what's going to dominate a lot of our conversation, where a lot of these wearable companies are taking what is the gold standard of measuring sleep, which is polysomnography, which is probably an order of magnitude more complicated to actually measure than power. If power is measured by a strain gauge and the velocity of the crank arms, sleep staging takes 4 or 5 different physiological measurements and combines them into, you're going to sleep here, light sleep, deep sleep, and you're coming awake here. And so it gets more complicated because of those 4 different types of four different types of measurements. But what the wearable companies are trying to do is akin to what PowerTap and Polar were doing in the early 2000s. Is they were taking this gold standard of polysomnography, which is widely recognized as the gold standard for scoring or staging sleep, and they're trying to make it more affordable than going into a sleep lab and getting your sleep measured with polysomnography. And they're trying to make it more accessible for everybody to do, as opposed to having all these devices on you and trying to go to sleep. They're trying to put it in the form factor of a ring or something that wraps around your wrist. Inherently, when you're doing that, when you're taking a gold standard and you're trying to move it over into a different kind of data acquisition method, it becomes problematic. And that's what Oura is trying to work through right now. And I can remember when their stage 2 ring came out, and that's what we're going to kind of start with right now. They had their own validation study, and everybody said, oh, it's scientifically validated, which all that means is it's had a study that has validated it. It doesn't say it's been validated to be good or good for half the people or not good for anybody. Those are all quote unquote validated. All those answers would be validated. And so when you dug into the actual study, the synopsis of it is, and I'm going to really trivialize this for the sake of time, is that it was pretty good at determining the borders of sleep when you went to sleep and when you woke up. And it was horrific in actually determining the different stages of sleep. And what I mean by horrific, it's a coin flip, right? You go look at the data, it's a coin flip. If you want to say you're in REM sleep for 20 minutes, you could or if the Oura ring was telling you you're in REM sleep for 20 minutes, you could either be in REM sleep for 40 minutes or no minutes. Like it literally was that, like those were kind of the borders of that initial study. So we fast forward now to the Oura Ring 3, which is coming out on all the influencers' fingers that we're seeing on Instagram. And one of the claims is that the sleep stage scoring is more accurate. And they have another validation study to quote unquote prove that. And kudos to Marco. What the heck is his last name? I got to go find the study on here right now.
Altini.
Marco Altini, who is the founder of Heart Rate. What's the name of the company? Heart Rate for Athletes, HRV for Athletes.
Possibly.
I'm going to put the link in the show notes. But he's been in the heart rate variability game for a really, really long time. And he's a consultant with Oura. So you always have to take the validation study that's produced by the manufacturer with a little bit of a grain of salt. But they are taking a new approach to the problem where they're using a combination of body temperature, autography, which is just body movement, and heart rate variability combined with machine learning, and this is kind of the new piece of it, in order to stage the sleep. And so they had this validation study with over 100 subjects where they're comparing polysomnography, which is the gold standard, to these new ways. And the study actually took a few different section or a few different flavors or a few different combinations of all these different ways. And the goal of it was to see which one of the combinations of all of these different other ways that we can approximate sleep stages is going to give us the best result. And so I'm going to start to open up to you guys because you guys have read the paper and I've got my own conclusions, but I'm not going to bias the discussion here. So on this first question of, is the Oura Ring worth it with specific regards to the sleep staging component, which is only one area of it? What do you guys have to say?
Can I just first, just one methodological thing that I think is really interesting between the first two studies? The first one was pretty small. It was slightly more men than women, and it was for one night in a laboratory setting. Mm-hmm. The new study,
the first quote unquote validation study.
Yeah. Well, quotes I think are important there. The second study was 3 different data sets, one out of Singapore, one out of Finland, and one out of the US. They were larger. Each individual data set was larger than the initial validation study. And there were actually equal to slightly more females in each of those groups than there were in the initial validation study. So I think, and they were longer. It wasn't just a one-night study. So I would say, just to set the stage a little bit too on the new research the validation study, is that it's a higher caliber data set that they're working with than from 2 years ago in 2019 when they did the first validation study. So I think that's important just to note as we talk about advancements in both the technology and the research.
Also groups across different continents.
Yep.
Which is a big one.
And the mean age as well. It went from, let's see here.
It was pretty young in the first study.
Yeah, Singapore, 16.4 mean age, Finland, 38 years old, and then USA 45. So that's pretty interesting to see that it had a wider range of ages.
So I think we can conclude that the validation study in quotes is better, right?
Yeah.
We still come down to, we still come down to the question, and that's fair. And I would say that the first validation study was weak. That I don't think anybody here would disagree with that, nor anybody who's actually in this space would disagree with that. But you got to start somewhere, and it's a reasonable place to start. I don't mind the marketing team saying that there's a validation study there, people extrapolating that the validation is good or bad. We can blame those people for that type of analysis. But here, once again, to set this up again, you have this gold standard, which uses several different ways to stage and score sleep, right? You've got a bunch of different things hooked up to you. They're measuring brain waves. They're measuring muscle activity. They're measuring your ECG or your cardiac or different types of cardiac signals, and they're putting that all into, this is when you go to sleep, this is when you're in deep sleep, this is when you're in light sleep, this is when you wake up, and what those cycles look like. The Oura Ring isn't capable of making all of those measurements, but they're using surrogates to approximate for all of those and then comparing it to the gold standard. And so I want to hear from you guys again after like reading through this whole thing. Is it doing a good job of scoring this sleep? I mean, going back to the listener's question that I started with, is it worth it with this particular respect? And we'll get into the other areas in a little bit, I promise.
My big, like, just simple answer is it's a lot better, but it still has a lot of limitations. And is it worth it? I think there is some room for improvement before I think it's really good at detecting what it says it's going to detect in terms of sleep.
Like, what are you going to use this data for? That's a good place to start if it's worth it or not. So if this is measuring deep sleep and REM cycle more, we need deep sleep. That's when we recover from a physical standpoint as athletes. We definitely would like to know that. And then REM sleep, that's when the brain is resetting, recovering, so to speak. So yeah, knowing those data points would be very helpful. But what is the athlete going to do to change that? I mean, I think it's pretty obvious. We all know the things to do to sleep better. Put your phone on the other side of the room. Don't look at blue light. Don't drink alcohol close to bed. Do all those things. But like, is having this data going to make you more neurotic and give you more anxiety? Or is it going to motivate you to do the things you know you need to do?
Corinne's laughing her ass off, so you better jump in.
Oh, no, I just, when people ask me about this, it's like, it's a habit tracker at the end of the day, right? It's if you need this thing, and they kind of say that at the beginning of the second paper a little bit, that there's like this habit tracker component of it, like it holds, quote unquote, can hold you accountable. And so I think that's the biggest thing. And is like, do you need to spend the money for something for something to encourage you to get into bed at 8:30? Or for something to encourage you to not drink alcohol every night or to drink caffeine late in the day, right? Like, you could hold yourself accountable. I've got a sticker chart in my daily planner that I use to hold myself accountable, but you could also, spend money on this. I'll agree with Steph here that the data is like, it's saying that it's better, particularly in 2-stage. And I was trying to dive into that a little bit more, the 2-stage versus 4-stage. I feel like that's maybe a little bit high level complication there. It's getting better, but it seems like there's certain areas where it still has a long way to go, despite the addition of all these like different factors that it can measure. Like, which I don't know. I don't think that it's quite there yet to be this perfect measure. And so I'm not sure why, like what is the necessary investment for an athlete in that if it's not completely accurate.
So here's the issue that I've always had with you're using it as a behavioral tool, right? We all want up, down, or sideways indicators. Are things getting better, worse, or the same? And we do this in the physiology lab. We measure people's VO2 max and their power at lactate threshold, their pace at lactate threshold, their pace on different intervals and things like that. All as indicators of, are you getting better or are you getting worse? If you're using something like this in terms of, is my sleep getting better or worse? And inherently, the way that you are determining that does not have a certain level of accuracy. You are making behavioral changes with which you don't really know either what is going on beforehand or what is going on afterwards. And so this goes back to my coin flip thing initially. If I have an athlete that says, okay, I'm starting it, I'm just going to give it a 1 to 10 score just to make it easy for everybody to understand. I start out, I get my ring, and it's telling me that I'm sleeping at a level 5 and I want to improve that to a level 7 or whatever. I make a behavioral change. I put my phone on the other side of bed at night, like Ryan just mentioned, and all of a sudden that 5 went to a 4. You don't know whether that 5 went to a 4 because that behavior didn't work, or because the readings and the way that the scoring system works inherently, and now with the new machine learning, it's the same thing. You don't know if that's adding a degree of variability that supersedes the amount of improvement that you might get from the intervention, which is a big thing, right? A lot of times the magnitude of the change from the intervention is smaller than the accuracy and the precision of the way that you're measuring that certain thing. And we see that once again, even in the lab. If you have a 2 to 3% accuracy with whatever measurement and you get 2% improvement, you can actually show it as getting 1% worse, depending upon how you're measuring things. And with the wide swath of what I'm seeing in this latest research paper, I still, even though they'll come to the conclusion that it'll track, sleep stages to 96% or whatever, I still look at the wide swath as problematic, because you don't know those before and after points, and the magnitude of change is just so small. Go ahead, Corrine.
So I think that's like the perfect little thing that I wanted to add earlier. That is only the 96% accuracy that they're going to claim is for 2-stage classification, which is only delineating REM from non-REM, versus 4-stage classification. The best they could get there was just under 80%, it looks like, which is different, right? And that's going to be light sleep, deep sleep, getting 4 stages of classification out of there. So once again, it's like what data is actually valuable there, and what is the accuracy of that data?
Yeah. I mean, you're kind of faced with two problems, in my opinion, right? You make all the behavioral changes that Ryne just mentioned, and we could go over however many more there actually are. There's probably 10 of them, right? Cool room, it's dark, put your phone on the other side of the room, no blue light, keep your room uncluttered, all those, kind of all those things. And you hope that those behaviors are going to result in some sort of positive movement, if we're talking about it in sleep. And it's kind of the same thing with training. If you're not tracking training, right, you hope that all the intervals that you're doing are going to improve you, but if you're not tracking that, you really don't know. But here, when you have a way of actually recording it, and the magnitude of those changes is so small compared to the accuracy level, it becomes inherently problematic, because you really can't track, are those behavioral changes actually making a difference. And going back to the neurotic aspect of it, absolutely, if I put the phone on the other side of my room and my sleep score got worse, I'd bring the phone back to my head. I mean, because it's data, right? It's science. Go ahead, Steph.
I think what the consumer doesn't realize is that this is a surrogate measure and it's not always accurate. And so we tend to take these scores from these devices, whether it be an accelerometer or an Oura ring or just even a heart rate monitor, and we assume they are 100% accurate. And that is not the case. And I think that's where the problem comes in, because you're just looking day to day at your numbers and not realizing that there is a lot of variability and it's not always super sensitive, specific. And when you use it as a hard rule of like, this is what it is, that's where you get into trouble. And then if you take a step back even further, it's like, do we need something to tell us if we're getting enough sleep? I mean, I can tell you nights when I don't get enough sleep, I can tell in the morning. It's not that I need a tracker or a number to give me a sleep score. And that's overgeneralizing it, but that's kind of like the practical application, I think, of using a tracker of sort to give me more numbers, whether or not they're accurate or not.
But a lot of people dig it. I mean, I've probably had 6 of my own athletes either ask or just do this without asking, go and get a wearable, and then we're trying to incorporate the data, into training in some kind of logical way. And I kind of agree with you, Steph. It's hard for me to honestly say, okay, we're going to do this or do that based on what I'm seeing. The best example are the Whoop scores. Like, there's no correlation between the Whoop, what do they call it, readiness score, right? Is that right? Or recovery score? Maybe it changed. That's why I'm getting confused.
I think it's readiness.
I think it's readiness.
Their MO.
There's I find no correlation between, if I give a hard workout to an athlete and their readiness score is 200 versus 20, There's no correlation on that athlete's performance between those two wide swaths. Zero is like zero at all. They perform really good when it's 20, they perform really bad when it's 200, and then like vice versa the next week. It's just so, from a practical perspective, I've always found that really frustrating.
Well, and you see that number too, and you're like, oh, well, I can't, obviously I can't do the workout today. And you get in your head about like, I'm in the red. So clearly like I shouldn't be doing this today. And it's like, well, it's not, once again, it's not, as Steph mentioned, it's not perfect. Right. And like they try to play it off as if heart rate variability is this like hard and fast data point. And it's really not. Like the best way to, even if you want to use heart rate variability, isn't a one-off number. Like it takes a lot more time and effort than that to look at like a rolling weighted average of this value. And context is always going to be important. And I feel like context is oftentimes lost when you're using one metric to be, the how you steer the ship. That's not how it works.
Yeah. Ryne, what were you going to say? You were going to jump in there really quick.
I was going to say to Stephanie's point when she said, I know when I haven't got a lot of sleep. I mean, yeah, like mom, dad, like I'm trying to train, I'm trying to work, I'm trying to get my kids to bed. And then you're just going to get this other thing to tell you you're not getting enough sleep and add stress to yourself. Why would you do that to yourself? You realize all the battles and limited time you have. Don't get something that adds stress to the pie.
Becomes more of a psychological issue then too. And if you think you're getting good sleep and you wake up race morning and you're in the red, it's like, oh crap, like, and that's not necessarily, if it's not a true score measured based off of something physiological, you don't necessarily need that to already kind of set you back when you're going to the start line.
So I'm going to present the argument from the data scientists out there that I see a lot, and I've had to think really hard about this because I think it plays out differently in different sport groups. But what they will say is that including this type of biometric data, and we're going to broaden this out from just a sleep score, right, to biometric data, whether it's heart rate variability, your body temperature, or whatever, to help direct training in the sense that I'm going to go easy on these days and go hard on these days, either in full or in part with this biometric data. What that enables you to do is to give you a better rule set to go from, as opposed to the athletes who inherently want to work really hard, especially at the real level, from going, yeah, coach, I can go hard again today. That's what they will say. They will say that this gives you something. It might not be perfect, but it gives you something that you either use wholeheartedly or in isolation, I guess is the best word. You either use it in isolation or in addition to other variables to help come up with that training directional arrow in terms of what to do. What, you guys can hear my dog in the background. She's going to annoy the crap out of us for the rest of this deal. What do you guys think of that?
I'd say, yeah, that could potentially work, because if you're an elite level athlete, especially let's say at the Olympic level, where you could potentially have a team helping you, where you've got your coach designing your workouts, you've got somebody working with you from the nutrition side, and now you bring in this sleep coach, so to speak. Yeah, if you could balance all that out, I mean, that would be awesome to have all those different experts to help you. But yeah, it's not applicable to the majority of the population.
I slightly disagree. I see value in making sure all of those areas of your life are dialed in, but I'm not certain that a sleep score is going to tell me if I can train an athlete differently. I think the feedback I get from the workouts and from the athlete themselves of how they feel and all the things that are going on in their life, I think are going to be a lot more indicative of their ability to train, whether they need an easy day or if they can keep pushing, than just looking at a number. So I do see value, but I also think we can't just use numbers to override our dialogue that we have with athletes, and really just checking in and using our words and not just looking at numbers.
Yeah, I mean, we kind of had this conversation as a coaching group all the time of what's our most important thing in Training Peaks, right? And the platform that we're using to prescribe training from. And I think 9 times out of 10, it's subjective post-workout comments, right? Like it's understanding how the athlete felt about the workout and using that in conjunction with the data to decide how the workout went and what they can handle the next day or how they feel the next day. So I think I think we do athletes a disservice to say that you need a number to steer your training versus just being able to listen to your body. And I know that's easier said than done. I myself have been an athlete when I've ignored all those signals and kept pushing because, you're driven, you're motivated, and you want to succeed. And so I think part of that is, though, that goes back to Steph's point of like having that dialogue of having someone that you trust and that is part of your support system to temper those personality quirks and allow you to listen to your body and allow you to have honest post-workout feedback and not ignore those signals. So I think that, I mean, there've been studies done on AI coaching, right? And this is coming down the pipeline for all of us. Like there is AI machine learning stuff in the pipeline. This is some of it. They've done studies on with control groups with HRV driven, I would say, workout prescription, right? If your HRV says this, we do that versus whatnot. And, basically the HRV group had slightly fewer, but not a whole lot less intensity sessions during those. And they came out about even. So I don't know. It's AI is coming, machine learning is coming, but it's going to be, at the end of the day, you're still a human being with a brain. And I think we have to listen to that as well.
I think that when we're looking at this in totality, you guys hit the nail on the head, right? You're using subjective feedback first and foremost, and then you're using workout data second. And then it's almost like a pick'em behind everything else that you can use. And I've always thought that those first two steer the ship so strongly that the rest of everything, even if it's really good, provides such little steerage that it's always like a nice to know or I don't really care. That's what I've really thought is that the first two, when you're looking at this proposition of something providing information to steer training, I'm going to go hard on Tuesday or I'm going to go easy on Tuesday. Those some things should start with subjective feedback and then how the workouts are tracking. And then everything else, like, I don't even know. I mean, it's hard for me to even say that it matters like 1 or 2% because it might not matter. It kind of like might not matter at all. So then I'm left with okay, is this a compliance mechanism for, some other habit that we want to try to reinforce? What do you think, Ryne?
So subjective feedback, best thing for the athlete and the coach and that relationship of honest communication. Our data on Training Peaks is helpful. And then if we start bringing in these other data points, then maybe the athlete starts doubting their own subjective feedback. And that would be a vicious cycle because then they're not able to communicate with their coach honestly. It's like, well, my sleep tracker said I'm good to go, but I don't feel like it. I need to give that feedback that I actually do feel good. And that is very problematic.
Well, in a lot of ways, these devices. So you guys can remember at the coaching summit that we had. If you listen to Justin Ross, Ryne, you're going to help me out. Oh no, wait! I wrote this quote down in my notebook. Hold on, give me 2 seconds. I'm going to find it. He had this really interesting quote that said that. And so Justin Ross is a sports psychologist. I've had him on this podcast. He was an advisor of the book, and he's very, very good at what he does. He said, athletes who can self-regulate better are going to make better decisions and therefore perform better. And part of that self-regulatory, so first off, shout out to Justin. What he's saying by that is that as coaches, we should be assisting them in their not only in their physiological capabilities, but in their capabilities to self-regulate, right? To say, okay, I'm going harder, I'm going too easy. And I feel that a lot of, and even the power meter does this, back to my original point, when we're throwing in tools that would run counter to that goal, we have to look really hard and really fast at, or really hard and really deep at, if we want to actually incorporate those tools with athletes. And this is a good one, right? If you're using your readiness score, your sleep score, or whatever to determine, am I going harder? Am I going easy? As opposed to the athlete being honest in their communication and saying, I'm cooked or I'm not. That is regressive in terms of helping the athlete be, or it's counterproductive to helping the athlete be self-regulatory. So I've always, or I've not always, but I've looked at these pieces of technology through that lens as well, in terms of, is this going to facilitate their own self-regulatory capabilities, or is it going to actually make that problem worse? What do you guys think?
I agree with you. I think it's a regression. And I think I like to think of it like nutrition, where our bodies have so many systems in place to tell us when we're hungry, when we're full, and we have the ability to override those systems on a daily basis. And when we start to use external feedback to tell us when we're hungry, when we think we should eat, then we're really confused and we're not able to listen to our body actually giving us those hunger cues or those fullness cues. And I see this in a similar manner of, we're not listening to our bodies. As cliche as that sounds, we're using an external number, and that doesn't empower athletes to know what's going on and to be able to feel that of like, yeah, I'm ready to go, or, oh, I'm actually really tired today. And it takes away a piece of that, just being honest and communicating. So I agree that it can be a bit of a regression when we're not actually tuning inward, which I think is the strongest thing we have as athletes and as coaches, to talk with our athletes about how they're feeling internally.
So are any of you going to go ahead, Ryne?
So to steal something from Justin Ross's presentation about this, okay, we need to be communicating with our coach often, because they're going to give us insights that we didn't fully see. They're going to be empathetic towards us, and we're in turn going to be empathetic to ourselves. And he had one study he cited, it's like, the higher your emotional intelligence is, then the greater use of your coping strategies. And then the most successful athletic performances correlate to the effective coping strategies. So that was very layered. But basically, the more emotionally intelligent you are, the better you're going to cope when it gets hard, and not only the races, but your training and handling the stress of life and all the factors that go into being an athlete.
Let me pose this a different way, and we're going to move from sleep staging onto another area of this wearable. And I told you guys this is going to take up the whole time. But let's say it was perfect. Let's just say that we could wave our magic wand and all of a sudden have a perfect way to collect and analyze sleep. And then we could use that. Then it was we knew exactly when the athlete went to sleep, exactly when they went into REM sleep, exactly how long the REM sleep was, and exactly when they woke up. It was perfect. There's something that, somebody came up with that can measure all that and pipe it into our Training Peaks dashboard at 6 a.m. when everybody wakes up, and you can look at that number and use it for something before the athlete goes out and trains. Would you use it, and what would you use it for if it were perfect?
I don't think that would make me a better coach. I would use it in context with some of the other numbers, but also if you don't go out and try, even if you didn't get good sleep, I don't think that's going to make or break a workout. I think there's other metrics that are more central to performance than sleep. So I don't think it would be that useful for me.
Go ahead, Corrine.
I was gonna say, so we know that sleep is obviously, from like a long-term perspective, very important, but I don't know, I don't think it's the king metric here. Like when I see these wearables, sleep isn't the thing that I find most intriguing about them even. And so, yes, from a long-term perspective, being able to be like, hey, like, I have to do this, subjectively. It's like an athlete says they're tired, and I say, okay, well, have you been sleeping? And then they say, well, no, my 2-year-old's sick. And I'm like, okay, well, now we might know why you might be tired. So I don't know, like sleep gives me maybe that layer, but it's not, once again, that's just kind of policing an athlete's habit or like habits, or letting them police their own habits, to me, that's not necessarily valuable information day in and day out that I need from an athlete in order to coach them.
Ryne, what do you think?
I'll answer from the opposite side for the sake of the conversation. Yes, I'd love to use it as a coach because I feel like I could plan the harder efforts and when they're recovered, of course. So okay, we've got this VO2 hill interval block we're starting. We've got 3 workouts in the first week. Of course, they're going to be a little worn down. That's what we're expecting as we go on. And then maybe they just drop out the floor and it's like, okay, let's cut. We don't need to do that anymore. But yeah, it would be really, really cool if they could give us 100% accurate representation of the recovered, let's work hard, or hey, let's back off, the 2-year-old is sick, we're not getting that amount of sleep.
Sleep and recovery
And
are not the same metric. Like that to me is important here. Sleep and recovery are not the same metric. Sleep is important for recovery,
100%.
but it is not, they're not an equal, like it's not like it's not perfectly equal there.
Yeah.
And I think if you're using sleep as like a metric to determine if you're ready for hard work, then it's like you're shuffling around workouts almost on a day-to-day basis, at least a weekly basis, and you might not have a good buildup. You know, if you're trying to work on upper end fitness and you're doing a lot of VO2 max workouts, they need to be in sequence. Like you can't be like, oh, we're going to do one this Tuesday and then you're not recovered, so we're going to push this one way back to next Thursday. And I think it just keeps it just, instead of placing like the lens on the big picture of the block, it's like day to day and almost micromanaging it in a way that's not useful.
We think this
a
is
lot more work for the
complicated.
coach. Yeah.
Well, yeah. So we think that this is complicated. Just as a little bit of an anecdote, there's this company called Omega Wave, who a few of you guys might be familiar with, that has been trying to solve this kind of in a different way for maybe 3 decades now. I remember seeing their the first iteration of their device in maybe like 2005 or 2006, and they actually have good penetration in some of the interdisciplinary sports, like combat sports and things like that you have to train a lot of different areas, right? You have to train power, you have to train speed, you have to train endurance and things like that. And their whole system is aimed at giving you these stoplight systems specifically for the type of training that you are primed for the day. So if you're really primed to adapt to, let's just say, a power workout, right? It will take all of these biological measurements and say, you know what, you need to go lift fast. Or if you're really primed for a strength workout, they'll say, okay, you need to go and train strength. Or if you're really primed for an endurance workout or really primed for rest, it kind of categorizes it differently, and gives you guidance on the type of physiology that you are most apt to be receptive to based on those based on those biological inputs. So it can get way more complicated, but I've thought about this a lot. If the measurement was perfect, because we don't need perfect measurements, but we need them to be pretty freaking good in order to make sense out of them. If it were perfect, I might use it 1 out of every 100 workouts. So does that make a difference? Maybe for 1 or 2 athletes. Maybe it makes a difference. And what I mean by that is if I saw a sleep score that was really horrific or really good, and it lined up with 2 or 3 other pieces of data that all were giving me the same directional arrow. They were in a bad mood. They had, 2 previously poor workouts. Then I would say, okay, my plan was to do this. Since all these directional arrows are pointing the other way, let's do that. That would be the use case for it if we had, in my opinion, if we had perfect numbers, as I would use it alongside other data to come up with that training direction. If they were all collaborative, right? If they were all kind of pointing the same direction. If they're all pointing in different directions, which is the 99 times out of 100, you still have to use coaching instinct or kind of rely on the plan that you've built beforehand, which should be rooted in solid physiology from the get-go.
Well, and here's one more thought to that, because this is a factor that we experience as ultra runners. Like, how many people sleep well the night before a race or 2 nights before a race? I know I've slept terrible before some of my best races. And if I had used my sleep as a kind of I guess, a metric for if I'm going to go do long runs or if I'm going to do my workouts, and I just like skip it when I'm tired. Then I get to like race day and I'm like, oh crap, I'm tired. I've never done this before. And I think that's doing a disservice to athletes as well.
Yeah, we can go back. Corinne probably knows the story better than I can. So if you want to elaborate on it, do it. Where they've blinded Olympic level athletes to their heart rate variability scores, which is part of this whole mix. They've blinded the athletes to those specifically before competition. And what ends up happening a lot of times, because of all these, sleep disruptions and things like that, the times where their heart rate variability is the lowest, which would be indicative of they're not going to perform good that day, or they're not going to perform very well that day. They've gone out and won medals. When if you were evaluating that from a training perspective, you go, oh, your heart rate variability sucks. Let's, do an easy run today or something like that. These people were like winning friggin' gold. And Jessie Diggins, right, was the one who specifically won a gold medal when her heart rate variability was saying that she wasn't going to perform very well that day.
Yeah, they use a Suunto-based software called First Beat that does some overnight reading stuff. Very Scandinavian company. But additionally, there's kind of this, I don't know, in my mind, kind of an OG paper in the HRV space that was written in 2014. Who's it by? Martin Boucher. I'm probably not saying his name right, but it's called monitoring training status with heart rate measures. Do all roads lead to Rome? And it's probably my favorite heart rate variability paper out there. And partially it's because it expresses the nuance of these readings, i.e. saying this is actually really complicated, and that we assume that high heart rate variability, low resting heart rate, that's always a positive. It's not always the case. There's actually all these different factors that could create that dynamic, or high heart rate variability, high resting heart rate, or low heart rate variability, high resting heart rate. All these different like pairings of these metrics do not always equate to what we think they should. Like while athletes are tapering, actually, your heart rate variability can get low, and just the nervous system response to this reduction in volume. And that, like, if you're a coach or an athlete only using readiness scores, and you happen to be an athlete whose heart rate variability drops actually during tapering, you'd be panicking, right? Thinking that you weren't going to perform, but truly that's just your nervous system's natural response to that training, like that change in training. So I think it's really easy to fixate on these values having to say a certain thing. And it's truly so much more nuanced than that, that I don't know that AI will ever be clever enough to figure out that nuance without the necessary context. And once again, like, context is key. And the simple inputs that they're getting from a wrist-worn monitor or a finger-worn monitor can't, unless, I don't know how it could take in all that context appropriately.
So we're kind of poo-pooing on this a lot. I didn't expect this conversation to go quite down this rabbit hole. What is, like, the Oura Ring and other wearables measure other things. There's heart rate variability, there's body temperature, and sometimes all of those things get combined into a score and stuff like that. What in you guys' eyes are the potential use cases, if there are any? I'll start out, since I've gone last the last few times, but I would use body temperature. If I saw athletes' body temperature rising over the course of a couple days and they were feeling poorly, I'd be like, you might be getting sick, let's back off. And the reason one of the reasons that I don't really hesitate that much in giving that counsel is because I know that they're not going to miss out on any training, because you can only handle so much stress over long periods of time. And if you have a few things that are telling you that you need to back off, and body temperature is a pretty powerful one in my opinion, you can just say, okay, we're going to take this rest phase, or even a little short rest period earlier, and that work that you were quote unquote missing out on just gets replaced 4 weeks or 6 weeks down the line. So I view that as if there were one thing that I would use the most out of this $400 device, and I don't know what their plan is to actually access that data, $10 a month or something like that. I honestly think it would be that. I just take body temperature. I take body temperature and the awake sleep duration, and that was it. So that's me.
Yeah, I think those are useful. I think looking at trends over time So if you're wearing this device for months and maybe have like a lot of data, you can see changes throughout the season, and you can learn things about yourself. I see it more of a long-term, interesting N of one project that you can learn more. And I always think tracking and learning more about yourself is useful. I just think you have to take it with a grain of salt and know that it's not perfect. So day to day, there's probably some variations. Like zoom out and use that information to just see long term how you're moving throughout your life.
Corrine, do you want to mention the period prediction part of the new Oura ring? There are a couple of other wearables that are trying to do it as well as AI that's trying to get at it.
So as soon as you said, well, if my athlete's got this increase in body temp and they're not feeling good, maybe they're getting sick, or maybe they're about to menstruate, or as Steph mentioned in our chat as well, or ovulation. So body temperature changes are part of hormonal fluctuation over the course of a woman's menstrual cycle month to month. And so using that data with Oura, they're going to basically include a period tracking component of the app, which will allow women to kind of monitor that. I think part of it's going to be predictive, but the idea here, and Steph and I have talked at length about this in the process of writing actually the next edition of your book, was that tracking is important in part because you're learning, once again, individual variability about yourself, as opposed to like what, broadly we assume is the same for every single person who menstruates, which is not the case, right? So there's a lot of individual variability, and understanding how you feel in and around different phases of your menstrual cycle. It can be important, valuable information for you and for your coach. That being said, I'm not exactly sure how that will look in the newest edition of the Oura Ring, akin to your mention about being sick. So Oura Ring has been using body temperature, tracking that finger temperature. And then Whoop has been using, I'm not exactly sure how this works on a wrist-worn monitor, but they track respiratory rate with theirs, and they use that as an indicator of potentially becoming sick. They've got a bunch of COVID study data in and around that, both with vaccine, getting the doses of the vaccine, and with athletes or people who got COVID while wearing the devices as well. So they've got some interesting data sets out there. But I think akin to Steph, like I think the long-term stuff, like akin to getting blood work done, right? When do you want to get blood work done? Well, I'd like you to get blood work done when you feel good, right? You need a baseline of something to go off of if you're trying to look for detectable, important changes. And then understanding, how much of a change in any of these variables is meaningful, is also, one, complicated, and two, very individual. And so I think having that long-term data would allow you to possibly decipher what meaningful changes are for the individual, if that makes sense.
So both of you, I'm going to synopsize that a little bit. You both of you, and I agree with both of you, think the power is in the long-term tracking, not I'm going to do this tomorrow or that on Wednesday. It's looking at patterns over long periods of time and seeing how everything influences those patterns, just like training.
Yeah,
Corinne's giving me a
thumbs up.
This is a podcast, Corinne. It's going to come out on YouTube. Like 10 people like watch the YouTube channel, so people can't see that. Ryne, do you have anything to add to that?
That is an appropriate synopsis.
I would say keep it simple. If you've got the time slept on your phone in the app and you see, oh man, I've only been getting 5 to 6 hours of sleep the past week. That's not good. I'm going to get in bed early. Like, keep it simple, I mean, Koop, you've mentioned that. It's like, yeah, if it makes you get in bed earlier, great. Or you can be like Corrine and having your log with your stickers to track it that way.
I like Corinne's, like, they're probably a tenth of a penny each sticker compliance mechanism as opposed to a $300 tech device. All right. So this is a big no, or maybe, if you've got the $300 to throw at it.
I think that's fair. I think it's, do you need it? Not necessarily. I wouldn't use it blindly. If you've got a coach,
that's the biggest issue I have.
Don't spring it on them. Have this conversation with your coach if it's something that's practical for you or not. But I think you're buying an expensive habit tracking device
That's
than
the
anything.
that's the biggest. It's the blind following. And here's the thing, I can get a soapbox since we're at the end of our time here, and I can do that because it's my podcast. The blind following is created from the device manufacturers trying to extract as much value as possible out of the data that they're collecting, and they put it into all of these different, suggestions on what people should do about their fitness and wellness and training. And it's too much of a leap of faith to go from those measurements to go run hard tomorrow without some sort of advanced or human intervention to filter through all the noise. And it's the blind following of that really kind of that's what kind of like irks me the most. The people that'll wake up and say, oh well, I'm supposed to run hard today, or I'm supposed to work out easy or whatever because of my body temperature is 1/10 of 1 degree different, or I'm getting a readiness score of less than 100 or whatever the kind of baseline is. That's the piece where I think we're not there yet, and I don't know if we'll ever get there, no matter how many different wearables we can kind of put on our bodies. Who's going to test them all? Who's going to wear the Whoop strap, the Oura ring, the Fitbit ones? But the Fitbit ones actually have pretty decent accuracy when we're comparing them all. Not that they're all great, but it's pretty decent. Who's going to wear them all and then compare them? Has somebody done that?
There's probably, I assumed you saw this Twitter thread. I will find it for you, Koop, and send it your way. But there's a great, and we'll make Koop link it in the show notes. But there's a great Twitter thread about this where a female researcher did this. She used Oura Ring, she used Whoop, and she used something else, and she compared, and exercises actively. She does CrossFit and she does cardio. And so she was able to look at like, how was it picking up stress from those workouts? How was it overestimating sleep? Was it, precise versus accurate? Like how consistent were the measures? And so it's actually very interesting. Obviously an N of one study, but I'll send it your way. And it's definitely a very interesting thread that we could link in the show notes for people just to see what someone did with that information.
So going back to my power meter analogy at the very beginning of this might have been DC Rainmaker's one of his first like deals that kind of put him on the launch pad. He did that with power meters. So he had like 7 power meters on his bike and compared them all in different conditions, which is really important, right? So, okay, I ride at 100 watts. So I ride at 200 watts. I ride at 300 watts. I do this interval workout, and how does it change? And it was really illuminating. The research came after that because it's harder to do, but it was really illuminating for the consumers because they could see, okay, these surrogate measures potentially could work in these conditions, and these surrogate measures are horrible. Like it kind of took the edges of the bell curves and completely threw them out because of this like really simple test. Granted, it was still on one person, because some of them were so horrifically inaccurate, to use that word again, because some of them were so horrifically inaccurate, the consumers filtered down the different products in a much more quick fashion than they would have otherwise. Super interesting. All right, that's it for today, you guys. Appreciate the conversation. As always, links to everything on the show notes. We will see you around next time. All right, folks, there you have it. There you go. Much thanks to those 3 coaches for coming on the podcast today and sharing some of their insight and wisdom. And I know that at times it seems like we were hating on a lot of these different pieces of technology, but really in actuality, we're kind of at the coalface of using these with our athletes. Our athletes can choose to buy any devices and incorporate any type of technology that they want to in their training. And at the end of the day, we as coaches have to be that filter that takes all of that information and makes it actionable and something that we can actually use to help improve athletes. If you appreciated this podcast, as we mentioned during the course of this podcast, it is not sponsored by anybody. That's a commitment that I made to you, the listeners. Over 100 episodes ago, when I started it, I was not going to take on any sponsorships or endorsements or partnerships to try to monetize this podcast. So if you enjoy this podcast, you can help us out tremendously by sharing it with your friends and training partners. You can hit me up on social media. And if you think that coaching is the right thing for you, either with one of the 3 fine coaches that we had on the podcast today, or any one of our other fantastic CTS coaches, you can go and check out www.trainright.com for all of our coaching packages, or you can reach out to me personally and I can help steer you in the right direction. That's it for today, folks. As always, we will see you out on the trails.